I've noticed many people don't believe in God because of evolution. Is evolution contrary?
Okay, so this is a short video that he's done talking about evolution. Is evolution contrary to God? And Mike has noticed that a lot of people disbelieve God because of evolution. Now, I famously made a video, my very first video on this channel was Ken Ham Made Me an Atheist. Now that's kind of a joke because it's a bit of an oversimplification of what happened, obviously, but it's nice for rhetoric. When I came to accept that evolution was real, was a scientific fact, and also that the theory of evolution, the scientific theory of biological evolution, had incredible explanatory power. Both of those things are correct. I didn't abandon my Christianity because of that. Specifically, it just set me on a journey of trying to figure out what in the Bible I could trust or what I couldn't trust. I don't think that Mike has phrased this correctly, that people, as soon as they come to accept evolution, that they immediately reject God. Obviously, there's theistic evolutionists all over the place. A lot of Christians believe in evolution, so those don't go hand in hand. I don't think they're causal. But what evolution, of course, does allow is it is a very natural way of looking at things and figuring out that the things that we used to think that we needed God to explain, we no longer need God to explain. Evolution is one of those things of biological diversity of life. Whether you think God controlled evolution or not, it's a process that doesn't require God, as best as we can tell. So yeah, evolution is problematic. I'm with you, Mike. And for the record, Mike actually doesn't accept evolution, but his argument today is that even if the thing he doesn't think is true, that's evidence for God. Because, of course, everything is evidence for God in a Mike Winger worldview.
Glory to God. Let me give you a simple example. Here's my cell phone. Imagine my cell phone happened from an explosion. Maybe we could prove it.
Okay. As soon as you hear someone who doesn't accept evolution talk about an explosion, that is a red flag that they don't understand evolution. I didn't understand evolution when I was a Christian. And yeah, and the notion of that anything related to an explosion can somehow correlate to evolution as an illustration is entirely ridiculous. At this point, we can know and understand that Mike Winger doesn't understand that which he rejects.
We could prove that the cell phone happened from an explosion and all the particles of glass, they kind of came together and the heat was just right, that it sort of came into this flat, perfectly solid form. Wouldn't we not therefore be logically reasonable by saying, boy, somebody brilliant must have planned that explosion?
Okay, so Mike thinks this is a great analogy, that an explosion happened, that glass heated and coalesced and formed into his cell phone. And therefore we're going to set aside for a minute that's nothing like what evolution would describe. Mike then wants to say, well, wouldn't the designer of that explosion be amazing? Yes, it would. Now, we can actually even set the explosion aside. Let's say that the year is 1700 and the smartest human on Earth in 1700 walked out of his log cabin and had a modern iPhone, Samsung Galaxy something, had a modern phone. That also wouldn't explain things because, again, that would be someone godlike, but he would have invented something useless. The phone, which we know was intelligently designed, happened step by step, right? We had the very first telephones, Alexander Graham Bell and others who created the first telephone-style communication. There was the invention of batteries. There was the invention of harnessing radio waves. There were invention of antennas. There was invention of, first of all, just glass, well-prepared glass, and then eventually touch screens and screens. Like all these things happened separately, iteratively, with intelligent design happening to eventually lead us to the point where the smartest people on Earth could take all of those parts and imagine them together to create a phone. Now, where am I going with this? Well, Mike wants to try and say that if God was behind evolution, that it's similar to an explosion that created this final result. Even if you want to give God credit for evolution, that is not the process that God has done here. It's not that Adam showed up on the first day if God created evolution. If God created evolution, if God was guiding it, he still guided the spectrum that was chemistry through to biology. The first molecules, the first proteins, the first RNA, the first DNA, that all still happened slowly. God built on that. Now, God may have set up the conditions of the universe that would allow that to happen and maximize that to happen. And then once molecules replicating, eventually forming cells, eventually forming replication with variation, eventually getting to even sexual reproduction, all these things. But God didn't design an explosion for this to happen. God would have designed a process that was very slow and entirely natural and indistinguishable from a natural process, is the thing, Mike. We don't see marks of, boom, there was an explosion and cells were on the scene or humans were on the scene or any of that kind of stuff. Like, this is just, it's not going to convince your theistic evolutionist friends either that you know what you're talking about.
That doesn't mean it was an accident. It means it was just even more brilliant, because not only did they cause it to happen, but they caused it to happen through one act of creation. But I don't think it's accurate, but I would absolutely use it as evidence for God.
All right. So Mike admits he doesn't think it's accurate. He clearly doesn't even understand it, but he's going to claim it as evidence for God, because if it did happen somehow in the weird way that he imagines it had happened, it's evidence for God. Now, I don't disagree. I actually think it would be more impressive for a God to create through evolution than through the story that we're told in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, where he creates, all the kinds individually, because it is kind of smarter to set up a system that allows for the diversity, much like, in its own way, if you write software to do a very specific task, say you have Photoshop or you have Google Chrome, or you got very specific software for different tasks, that's amazing and that's great. And that means they were very talented engineers that made that happen. But if we're on this cusp now where we're actually putting together software with large language models and that, where we don't actually know where it's going to go. We're kind of setting up the parameters by which it can go on its own and evolve in its own way. Is that more or less intelligent than the person who designs a piece of software? I think that could be a debate, which is more or less intelligent. But anyway, all this to say, Mike doesn't understand evolution, but he wants to claim it for God. Mike, there are much better ways to phrase this that are more intellectually satisfying and would actually ring true to the universe. Yeah, sorry, Mike. This is the kind of thing that would have convinced 5 years ago, 6 years ago, me who didn't understand any of this, but you need a better analogy, my friend. That said, I know a lot of Christians who would agree with you that God created evolution.